Well, good morning. I'm so glad you could be with me today in the Unfolding the Word ministry. We're today continuing our study of God's Word, verse by verse, in the midst of the book of Daniel. We're in the 6th chapter of Daniel now. The empires have changed. We're now looking at the early years, in fact, the early single year, the first year, of the Medo-Persian Empire, and particularly events occurring within the province of Babylon underneath the Medo-Persian Empire ruled over by Cyrus. I want to pick up our reading today, beginning in verse 6. Then these presidents and satraps came by agreement to the king, and they said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps and the counselors and the governors, are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and the injunction. Now, as you remember, in this new era, Daniel, now in his 80s, has been elevated and respected by Darius, the new king over the Babylon province, has been elevated up to leadership once again after periods of marginality in those 23 years following the death of Nebuchadnezzar, as enemies of Daniel, jealous people, increasingly marginalized him within the Babylonian Empire. As he was given positions of leadership, he did so well that Darius was going to encourage and move him to even higher levels, and it's at that point that the jealousy of the Babylon period now reemerges in the Medo-Persian period. The other leaders are not happy to have Daniel given any more authority. And so they developed a strategy, which we looked at yesterday, to investigate his behavior and job performance to find something that could discredit him. And while biased against him, they couldn't find anything that could be spun in such a way that it would discredit him. Very interesting outcome, and we talked about implications of that. So then, facing a dead end in that strategy, they made a shift of strategy. They said there's not going to be anything to be found ethically, morally, job performance-wise for him. But we will find something potentially in his faith. We have no question about his faith. We know God is first place in his life. We'll find something there that we can use to discredit him in the eyes of the king. That's how they put it in verse 5. We can't find any ground for complaint against him unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. Shift in strategy. So, now they come before the king, building on that shift of strategy, and we encounter our verses today. The problem is they came up with this strategy becomes apparent quickly as the strategy moves forward, and it is this. There were no current Persian laws that would have been a point of conflict for Daniel. Interesting, isn't it? Here in this godless, or at least idolatrous, Persian Empire, the Medo-Persians, they did not have on the books a law that directly conflicted with Daniel's faith in God and Daniel's commitment to obey God's word and God's direction in his life. I think it's tremendously significant that that was the case, because I'm of the conviction that, generally speaking, in most eras of history, even in our own at times, we will not find points of conflict with the formal laws of a land. Oh, it can happen once in a while. And there's certainly been examples of where specifically governments were put in power with the expressed intention of getting rid of some other religious group, whether it was Christians or others, and in which case there were certainly laws on the books. But generally speaking, that didn't happen. Why? Because the laws that make up the legal code of countries and nations from the ancient days until the present day are basically on the books to keep anarchy under control, to prevent the population from spilling out into riot. Instead, they want to control the population and control some measure of stability. The laws are not primarily there to attack a religious group or to attack the followers of the true God. Well, at any rate, that was certainly the situation in the Medo-Persian Empire. So you see, now they were faced with another strategy shift. We can't find anything on the books that would allow us to attack Daniel's belief system. So do we try to figure something else to attack? Or do we stay with this strategy and seek to get the king to create a law that then would be a point of conflict with Daniel? And of course, as I read these verses, you see the conclusion they came to is, no, we're going to stick with strategy number 2 here. But what we are going to do is create a law, convince the king to implement it, that would help to trap Daniel. So they went forward with that. They wanted to trick the king, Darius. And notice how they went forward. Verse 7 tells us that they went forward to the king as a united power base. What do I mean by that? Here was this collection of all the rulers, administrators, and counselors of his province. And they've come to him saying, listen, we're the think tank. We've looked over the issues. Here's our recommendation to you. And they implied that they were in unity about it. So Darius, accepting this report from the think tank of the day, assumed, well, they're all in agreement about this. This probably makes some sense. Maybe I'll implement the law that they're suggesting. By the way, the way that they came to the king implied that Daniel, who was one of the top 3 administrators, went along with the advice. They didn't say to him, listen, we didn't talk to Daniel about this. They implied that Daniel was in at least tacit agreement with everybody else on this. Okay, well, what was the law? Here was the new law. King, we suggest you forbid prayer, all prayer, for a 30-day period. Number 1, don't allow anyone to pray to anyone except you, king. I mean, we'll let that be the case, because certainly it'd be good if anybody begins to think of you as worth praying to. And by putting it this way, they implied they were trying to be fair to everybody. We won't just target the Jews or Daniel. We'll target everybody. No faith is exempt. Everyone must decide not to pray. Perhaps they even told the king this would consolidate your power and get rid of some of the potential problems arising from diversity within the empire. Who knows? Anyway, that was the first part. The second part was this: put some teeth into this law. Now, there's put teeth into this law by adding a death penalty if it's not obeyed. And this death penalty will be the lion's den. Now, the lion's den, just really quickly, was a form of capital punishment in the Medo-Persian Empire. It involved this: there was a deep pit dug that people up on the top could look down into. Somebody in the pit couldn't get back out of it. It had division. It was really a pit with 2 sides. One side is where the lions were kept. The other side is where the victim was placed. The lions were denied the normal food, and that made them ravenous. And at a particular point in time, the condemned individual, looking through the partition toward the place where the lions would be waiting for the sentence to be implemented. The partition would be lifted, and the lions would come in on that person and kill them. All right? A tough counsel. The third advice that they gave to the king was this: not only outlaw prayer for 30 days, not only put a death penalty with it to put teeth in the law, but write it down so there's no question about the authority of the law that you're implementing. Put it in writing. Now, why did they do that? Well, historians know. They explain to us that the writings of the day tell us that Persian law forbid a king from changing anything that was in writing, any law, edict that was in writing. That was to show that the king himself was subservient to the law. Once the king wrote the law down, he himself couldn't change it. And you see the strategy here? Get it written down. Then even in time, as the king would come to see, Daniel's in trouble because of this law, he would be powerless to do something about it. That was the situation. So what's the result? Darius accepts their advice. They're his think tank. He thinks everybody's in united belief about this, even Daniel. So he puts the law in the books, writes it down. He probably didn't even think too much more about it. He was a busy man. He had a lot on his plate. This must have been seen as a very minor issue. The trap was now set. The other leaders knew Daniel would be trapped, and the king would be powerless to help him. So now the only issue is, would Daniel take the bait? Or would he, and still pray openly? Or would he move to some sort of private faith? And by the way, governments are not threatened by private faith. They're threatened by visible faith. And God says, no faith in me is legitimate unless it is visible and practiced. Well, join me tomorrow as we see the continuing story unfold and how Daniel responds to the trap.